Hi. So when I first got back to school in September, the first question that people would always ask me was, how was your summer? Like, what were you up to? So initially, I'd always respond by saying I went to camp. But the reaction I got from that was sort of disappointing. It ranged from, oh, that's so sweet, to, oh, that's really fun. I used to do that too when I was in high school. So I decided to complicate things a little bit, and I started responding by saying, I went to peace camp. And that elicited a different reaction altogether, one that's sort of difficult to articulate or even really depict. So I tried to come up with some images to help show you guys what I meant. And this is the best I could come up with. So, oh, that one actually isn't working, but it involves like a laugh. So it was sort of a combination of all four of these expressions. It started off with just a look of utter confusion, and then they let out a laugh as they tried to figure out whether or not I was kidding. And when they realized that I was completely serious, you could just see the images of tie-dye clad youngsters dancing around in their minds. So at this point, I was confused. I didn't understand why they didn't see it the way I did. When I tried to describe or even mentioned peace camp, they didn't see the faces of the youth that I'd had the chance to get to know over the course of the summer. All they heard was an idealistic and unrealistic sounding idea. So I'd like to take this opportunity to make a couple of clarifications and introduce you to some of the faces that I had the pleasure of getting to know over the course of the summer. So last summer, I did in fact go to Peace Camp. It's an organization called Seeds of Peace that runs an international camp in Maine. They bring youth together from different sides of conflict zones to engage in a 3-week program. So last summer, 200 youth from Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Jordan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India all came together to live, work, play, and learn from each other. Now, to the untrained eye, this may sound like an oversimplified approach or even unfettered idealism. But everything that happened at camp was done with a specific purpose in mind. It was all carefully calculated. So initially when the kids got to camp, the first goal was just to build a sense of community and make sure they felt comfortable with the situation and the other, essentially. So sometimes that meant acting ridiculous, and as a counselor, making fun of yourself, or just laughing uncontrollably. But it was all part of the process. If you were to see me standing in front of 200 campers wearing heart-shaped glasses and singing and dancing to a made-up song about water skiing, you probably wouldn't perceive it as a peace-building measure. In fact, if I suggested that it was, you'd probably give me that look. But it was all part of the process. It was giving the kids something to laugh at together, and it was creating a sense of community among them. It was only really after, but this was not nearly enough. Obviously, these kids came with years of fear and hatred with them to camp. They brought that with them to camp. They brought an entire history of distrust and segregation. But it was only really after the first week that the stereotypes started to break down. All of a sudden, the narrative of the ruthless and vicious enemy that they had heard their entire lives collided with the image that they began to develop of the person who slept in the bunk next to them. Someone who they had shared stories with, laughed with, even told secrets to. All of a sudden, there started to become more to the identity of the enemy than the political narrative that was associated with it. All of a sudden, the enemy started to have a face. What's even more transformative, however, was the 1.5-hour dialogue sessions that the youth engaged in every day. It was in these dialogue sessions when the youth really confronted the issue of the conflict head on. And despite what many of the teachers and parents thought when they sent their kids to camp, dialogue was not about debate. So many of the youth came armed with stacks of papers and binders filled with facts and figures in order to defend their position and prove the other side wrong. But instead, what they found was a trained facilitator who created a supportive and structured environment with them where they could try to find and create a space where the two opposing perspectives could coexist. So there's a phrase that's often quoted at camp. It's from a famous poem, and it says, "Out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." And if you ever have the privilege of traveling into the depths of Maine's woods to Seeds of Peace, you'd find this sign in front of the soccer field and beside the dialogue huts, saying, "This is the field." And I think that clearly articulates what the outcomes and purpose of dialogue are. So dialogue can essentially be broken down into 4 phases. Initially, when the youth come together, the goal is just to build trust among them and to try to outline and formulate all the different perspectives that exist in the conflict and mutually acknowledge them. During the second stage of dialogue, the youth start to share their personal fears, hopes, values, interests, and experiences in relation to the conflict. And it's at that point when it's often the first time when the youth are able to personally encounter the personal narrative of the other side. And it's at that point when they're able to personally relate to the larger scale issue of the conflict. So during the third stage, the youth then begin to develop shared sources of identity, shared fears, shared experiences, and they start to collaborate on less controversial issues. And during the final stage, they bring their problem-solving skills together and try to develop some sort of joint action planning process in regards to the actual conflict itself. Camp culminates in color games, which is a 4-day competition where the youth are split into 2 teams, the blue team and the green team. They're split evenly among based on skill set as well as based on delegation. So all of a sudden, someone that you came to camp with, someone from your delegation, is now a part of the other side. And someone who you had previously conceived of as the enemy was your teammate or comrade. The kids began to embody the life, spirit, and mission of either the blue or the green team. They ate together, they trained together, they cheered together. They did everything in their power to bring victory to their side. You can tell by their faces, they meant business. All of a sudden, color games seemed to be like the only thing that mattered. But at the end of those 4 days, when the competition ended, no matter what team won or lost, both rushed into the lake and stood arm in arm and sung the "I Am a Seed of Peace" song. At that moment, it became extraordinarily clear that there was more to the other side than the political narrative, just like there was more to the opposition than the color of their shirt. And they realized that they could have just as easily been placed on the other team, just like their birthright has put them in a specific position in the conflict. They also came to note that how easily they were able to assume this ideology and identity of either the blue or the green team, and how quick they were to become all consumed in it and to want to fight to the end for that purpose. When the campers returned home after the 3 weeks and after color games, much to my dismay, there's regional programming in place to ensure that the process continues, that at the end of the 3 weeks, the transformation continues to happen, and that they have a support system available to them. So it includes regular events, including dialogue sessions, speaker events, and many other things. So hopefully you can start to understand my frustration when I came back from this incredible experience and I was greeted by this gaze of skepticism. I mean, they didn't have it all wrong. There was some tie-dye involved. But there was a structure to everything that happened at camp. There was a methodology in place to ensure that the process was as effective as possible. And at the end of those 3 weeks, there was a framework there to make sure that the youth had a safety net to fall into and a support system to rely on. So when I got back to camp, or when I got back from camp, a lot of my friends and family didn't listen long enough to hear about all these pragmatic aspects of camp. And they also didn't have an opportunity to meet the faces that I'd gotten to know over the course of the summer. So I want to take this opportunity to introduce you to one of my friends. This is Abed. He's from Qalqilia, Palestine in the West Bank, which is a city that is entirely surrounded by an 8-meter-high concrete wall, also known as the Israeli West Bank barrier. Abed was the first person from his city to come to camp, and when he did, he was extremely skeptical. When I first met Abed, he was standing on the side of a basketball game, refusing to be engaged. So I went up to him, and I was like, "Hey, friends, why don't you get in there? Your team's losing, they're down a player, they need you, come on, let's go." And this is the look he gave me. At this point, Abed couldn't imagine a situation where he could engage with the other, let alone become friends with them. Like my friends and family, he was rejecting idealism for the status quo. But over the course of camp, all that changed. On the right here is Jackson. So during camp, Jackson and Abed became great friends. They spent a lot of time together, they played, they did all the activities together, they were doing color games together, they got to know each other. And I think I was encountered by a gaze of skepticism when I returned. You can't even begin to imagine the kind of criticisms that they have received for maintaining this friendship. But despite all this, they remain close. And for the second time since camp, Abed has applied for a permit to travel to Israel, and he should be going at the end of March. I'm showing you this picture today because I want to emphasize the importance and power of giving the enemy a face. When I came back from camp, this is something that I experienced personally. In November, when the conflict erupted in Israel and Palestine, all of a sudden, the influx of news reports and articles weren't telling a story of a distant, faraway land that I had read about in a textbook. They were telling the story of the conflict between my little brothers and sisters. During this time, I Skyped one of my campers, and I picked up the Skype call, and I said, "Hey, MJ, how are you?" And he responded by saying, "Now that I'm speaking with you, I feel powerful." I realized that whether between an Israeli and a Palestinian, or a Canadian and a Palestinian, or even an American and an American, these human connections are empowering. It's these connections that have changed my perspective of the conflict, and these connections that motivate the seeds to remain seeds of peace and agents of change in their communities. Despite the universality of this gaze of skepticism, the process to overturn it is also universal. It's about being empowered by human connections, disrupting the status quo with dialogue, and trading in skepticism for action. I realized the universality of this process during second session, when the exact same model was used, but in a different context. In second session, the campers were all from the United States. So some of them were recent immigrants, some of them were refugees, and some of them were from small, racially and culturally homogenous towns in Maine. This is my table from second session, so we ate all our meals together. I'm not going to address the face we're making. I don't know what to say about that. But the point is, these youth were not facing conflict, or they were not facing warfare in their day-to-day lives. But that didn't mean that their lives weren't filled with conflict. It didn't mean that they didn't have walls built up all around them. I was fascinated by the way in which this model of dialogue sessions was seamlessly transitioned from the context of intractable conflict to the context of North American structural violence. And that led me to conduct my thesis on just that. And so far, what I've found is that this tool of dialogue is likely even more effective in the context of structural violence. It's been proven that the youth are able to create better connections among each other. They have improved intergroup relations. They become more socially and politically engaged. And they are able to relate to and problem solve the larger scale issues that they face on a personal level. So I was really excited. I thought I had found this amazing tool that could create so much positive change and transformation in many communities. But then I started to look around, and I wondered, why isn't this something that we see in our school system? Why isn't this something that happens on campus? Why don't we have dialogue sessions offered at local community centers? And why isn't this a tool that we use in our everyday lives? So those questions brought me back to this look. What's stopping the spread of this idea? And my answer was, how are we supposed to expect these ideas to spread if this is how we greet them? I'm all for assuming a critical gaze and questioning what is put in front of you. I myself have questioned the seeds process multiple times. But part of the value of Seeds of Peace is creating an environment, although it's sheltered. It's an environment where the youth are able to imagine a world where coexistence is possible and peace is plausible. A world where the enemy has a face. So I'd like to conclude with a quote that was next to my bunk for the entire summer. And it read, "You are not the dreamer, you are the dream." If you look up idealistic in the thesaurus, the second word you'll find is visionary. But when we think of idealistic, we think of unrealistic utopian visions. But when we think of a visionary, we perceive them as ingenious, active, and engaged. Until these ideas of peace and coexistence can be embodied by individuals and grounded in the relationships between people and perspectives of others, they will continue to remain and be perceived as idealistic musings of a starry-eyed dreamer. It is only when the dreamer embodies the dream that idealism can become a reality. It's easy to turn your back on idealism, but it's much more difficult to turn your back on a face. Thank you.